Hey, it's Chris. What are we talking about? Ascendancy. Let's go. 4X meets worker placement. I have a lot going on the table here. I'm going to give you a brief rundown synopsis so you can get a sense of what things are going on, how things are combining, and what you need to know. And then I'm going to give you my thoughts on things. Let's go. Truth be told, this is a big box. There are a lot of components. There's a lot of stuff going on. However, the first thing I'll say is that it flows actually rather smoothly through the 4 phases that you're taking in this game. And the big crux of this is actually set in these specific containers. And what these containers represent are the 4 different phases. And each of these containers gives you a self-contained how to do the phase. And so that's really nice, but as you can see, there's a lot of table space to go along with this. So essentially what you've got going on here is you've got 4 phases. The first one here, for example, is the frontier phase. It sets you up very nicely. This is probably one of the nicest intro how to play while actively setting it up and running you through the mechanisms that I've ever played, especially of a prototype game of anything this complicated. So you can see here, this is the frontier phase. Essentially, this is your exploration slash building phase, if you will. You're going to be going up against creatures as you venture out into these various hexes that are unexplored. But if you want to peek at them and know what you're fighting, this is where you get to do so. You're going to be scouting those locations, grabbing consumable items, as well as potentially building on your own personal tableau locations that are not only accessible to you, but your opponents as worker placement spots in the first place. So that is the first board. You also, as I have in the package still here, horses that are going to allow you to move across said board in the first place without having to pay one of the prerequisite resources. So what are those resources as we get into it? Well, that's the second phase of things. This is the supply phase. And you can see here that I've got 4 different resources allocated in this board. I've got food, ore, skills, and knowledge. Skills and knowledge are not necessarily technically what you would think of as normal resources, but when I show you the individual faction boards here in a second, they're going to be utilized to upgrade not only your individual faction abilities, but also the skills that are going to be available to you to make your tech tree shine. Now in this, you can take the banker to bank. And what I mean by that is you can buy these resources, you can sell these resources, you can invest, you can also build, but then you can just gather those resources in the first place in general. So that's the main mechanism of your income phase, if you will, from that aspect. The third one has a little bit of everything as well. It has your magical abilities, it has your quests, and it has the extra hirings of mercenaries that are going to aid you in combat. Not only that, you'll notice that these tiles that are hex-based on this grid have a lot going on in them, and I'll talk about them one by one specifically, but the big thing to note in this academy phase of things, or the third phase, the third different area in which you can place workers, is you'll notice that these are all their status effects as well, because depending on how you roll after an area you control at the end of the round is assessed, you can get these bonuses that are going to not only boon you, but also curse you, depending on if you're going up against enemy or enemies, even AI controlled. And then there's going to be quests that you can complete along the way that are going to give you victory points as well. And the victory points are in the form of crowns. Crowns being the main way that you're going to not only build your empire, but ultimately achieve victory at the end of however many rounds you decide to play, which they call essentially decades. So you're playing over a decade, and then whoever is the king asserts their certain viewpoint. And that's really where this last phase comes in. And you can see here this empire phase where you're looting, you're getting your champions that you can hire from your unique factions or even unknowns, as well as laws that are going to be enacted each and every round for the next round. And so if you're the king, you decide if this law is going to be maintained for the next round, or you're going to draw a new one that is going to change the dynamic of that round. So a little bit of everything there. Upgrades, loot, end game scoring. So that's the overview of the 4 phases, just in the most brief sense, so you can see that in all 4 of those areas, you have different workers that are going to be able to do different amounts of things. You also have the ability to ascend your workers. Basically, you get to upgrade your workers so that they can do a little bit more a couple times per game. So that's the overview of the phases. Now you can see the map itself here on the board in front of me. And so what you've got going on here is you've got a hex-based exploration system. This is that X. And so you're going to be going out and venturing forward to adjacent hexes, flipping them over from this tile stack and laying them out wherever you are going. Now the tricky part is all of these hexes, as you'll see here in the blown up picture, that they have victory scoring points on the bottom. Now left to right, the size of the structure is going to give you how many victory points it has, but also at the bottom of it, it also says it's going to give you plus or minus victory points depending on what colors are adjacent. So that is going to change which one you choose, because when you're exploring, it's draw 2, pick 1. Only after you then go to this place and then fight a monster, then you get to score the actual victory points that are listed. And so that also plays into, as I mentioned previously, the dice rolling at the top, and that's going to give you the benefit or the boon or the curse depending on how well you roll on those areas. And each area you explore, you're also going to get some loot, and the loot also needs to be identified, so it's not just go there, pick it up, get the reward immediately. So there is a layer to that as you go along. The 4 starting corners are over here, and then this sometimes will also, depending on your player count, allow for an AI system. Now this AI system plays into not only the cooperative, but it also plays into the competitive. So for example, this is a 2-player game where I played solo against the AI, and the AI just marches in the center in the solo scenario. So you can see that they've already done more than me in the same amount of rounds. And that's the dynamic you're going to be dealing with. The AI system itself is relatively intuitive. You roll dice to see where their workers occupy spots on those previous phase boards. They occupy spots that get in the way, and you're forced to choose accordingly. The AI system also works very similarly when you're doing combat here, for example, against the Mad Vizier. Numbering on what you roll depends on how he targets, how much damage he takes, as well as how he may evade your attacks. So the combat system is dice-based. In this sense, it's actually not dice-based system at all when you pull up your actual hero cards here, and you can see how they differ. With the hero here, you can see that the raider has 4 different abilities, and then it's starting energy each round. So they're going to get 2 energy to spend on any of these actions. Now there's obviously ways that they're going to be able to get 3 energy, and so that they can do this special attack. But otherwise you have a tactic which can be done at any phase, either attacking or defending, depending on who goes first. And then your attack, which deals damage and how it deals damage. Upper right hand corner is the health, and then the type. There are 3 types. You have an intellect, you have a brain, and you have a might. And so it sort of does a paper, scissors, rock style of weakness and defense. Whereas the Vizier here, for example, does not do damage to this type of hero. And so if that hero is, say, this guy, my raider, well, that's great. But if it's the weakness, maybe it does more damage. And you can summon other ones, especially like I said with the Elementalist. And then here are some of the example monsters that you're going to be going up when you explore these terrains to begin with. The Blood Imp, again, very similarly set up. The type, the health, what happens when you roll the dice on offense and defense, as well as the initiative, which is speed. Speed kills, right? So that's essentially the combat system in a nutshell. So what I've got set up now in front of me is one of the asymmetric faction boards. And I have the House of Khan! Sorry, couldn't resist the Star Trek. That's kind of why I chose it to play with, and kind of why I chose it for the video. But what you've got going on here, again, is you've got your phases set up via columns. And in each column, you're going to have buildings that you're going to be building, as you noticed in all of those phases, as well as your abilities. And the tech tree is actually hidden underneath here. If you look, you can kind of see, because as you build, you're going to slowly reveal it up and reveal these slots. And then you match the color of the resource that I talked about earlier into that slot, and it allows you to choose which one you want. So for example, if I put a blue cube into this first slot, I either get the choice of Trapmaster or Scoutmaster, so on and so forth. The green cube allowed me to recruit the Raider card in the first place. The Raider or any other character gets slotted here. You can only have 1 at a time. You could swap out, say for my Elementalist, depending on what battle I'm going into, because the monsters, if you peek at them, they get slotted here before you go and try and conquer and establish your new kingdom areas. So you can already start planning ahead. In the right farthest column, you have the Empire phase, where you are actively building parts of your empire. And so in this case, I built down here the artillery forts, which allows me again to activate during battle a different mechanism that's going to be a benefit of mine. I've got a quest over here that allows me to pay 5 and allows me to upgrade one of those workers at the end of a round. That's the nutshell that you're seeing. All of these columns are the same. They're all just slightly different. They all have slightly different requirements based on your starting values, which are indicated here on the 3 abilities. And then they will have to be upgraded because each of these, as you go deeper into this pile for the building style of things, is going to require a higher degree of that same characteristic. And so that's going to be the dynamic that you're dealing with as you go along. You have those 3 options of choosing down here which one you want to build or recruit. And so you're given a lot of different options with this tech tree in each area how you want to specialize. All 4 of the factions that are included in my prototype are all completely different in terms of these cards. So each faction will play dynamically different. Khan, as the name may suggest, like I screamed out there, is aggressive. I'm an attacker. I'm a conqueror. All of that stuff that I just mentioned is tracked here on this victory board. You can see the victories, the crowns in the middle, the income that goes along with it along the side, the round tracker marker, and all of the statistics here that are kept track of for the various players that are involved. So it's all self-contained on a separate board, so you're not having to keep track. It's also public information of who's where and doing what. So now that I've talked about the dynamics of the game, how does this game play? Well, to be frank, when I thought of 4X and I thought of worker placement, it sort of reminded me like worker placement deck building. I said, can this really be done? Does it really cohesively match? And in this case, it really gives you the full experience of a worker placement, and it really does give you the 4X on that hex-based grid map. Yeah, this does not just stand up to 4X in name. This actually gives you those 4 elements. The tricky part is going to be saying, is it enough in those 4 elements for you? Because I will make the argument that it is slightly more worker placement. I will make the argument that the worker placement, the 4X, it's all there. But if you're looking for a very deep experience of one aspect in particular of those, you may find it a little bit lacking. But what it makes up for then is it actually gives you a breadth of all 4 of them that, say, other games that may put their emphasis on one or the other do not. Although it states about 60 minutes per game per player, I would argue that it's probably a little bit less, actually, surprisingly, with the options of the worker placements, but combined with the limited workers in the first place, I found it actually going a little bit faster than similarly based just worker placement style games in the first place. The worker placement style of things is relatively straightforward. You see it, it is what it is, you can do what you need to do. It's not going to be heavy, crunchy, cutthroat, unless it's really being played at a higher player count. There are plenty of spaces. It's not going to be quite as pure optimization as people who are looking for a pure heavier worker placement style are looking for in the first place. Resources are obtainable, but they're not always easy. It's nice and it mitigates the worker placement crowd by allowing you to buy those resources like I mentioned. So it's always available to you at a price, but can you afford the price is the question. The tech trees here, all 4 on the board, are going to be giving you asymmetry between the factions, and that's nice. At the same time, you could find yourself a little bit min-maxing depending on how you play if you play a faction similarly each time. Now, they've designed a legacy component to go along with this, so depending on how you do at the end of a competitive or even cooperative scenario, you can gather one of those virtues or vices, if you will, the minor and major versions, to give your faction a little bit of nuance that wasn't there previously, which is nice. And there's a variety of those that are only given out so many per round. So what are some big positives? The factions are really asymmetric. They really are. Khan is very heavy on the attacking style of things. The modes that this game plays through, they are not drastically different. So you're not learning a different game. You're just optimizing in a slightly different manner. So it's not you having to learn a completely separate game, a completely separate mechanistic approach for the solo mode versus the cooperative versus the competitive. And personally speaking, that's nice because then it's not going to necessarily shift you to play one always if that's the one you first learned. And to be frank, the competitive and cooperative modes are, scenario-wise, very well fleshed out in terms of what I've got here cooperatively and competitively for the scenarios that are present in the prototype. There's variety in the scenarios provided. You have AIs that will interject depending on which mode you're playing in at various levels of difficulty that scale to the number of players. The tech tree is very nice. It's very intuitive. It's very easy to manage. Same thing with the resource management. There's not a lot of ambiguity. This game has clearly undergone some playtesting and some fine-tuning to make this smooth. Like I said at the beginning, this was probably one of the easiest to play, learn to play games that I have done of anything close to this weight recently whatsoever. And the rulebook exemplifies the care that's been shown putting that together. So I was very impressed. This is not a game that's going to be hard for you to learn in the first place. So what are things that people may have concerns about? If you're looking at this and you're going, Chris, is this for me? What are the big potential make it or break it for me? Well, for one, I think we have to talk about the combat system. In 4X games, oftentimes that is perceived in many of them as the weakest link. And I'll make the argument that this is probably going to be the most divisive for people looking at this because it sort of smashes together both a non-random and a random combat system. And so in these games, you tend to find people that really gravitate towards one or the other, right? Like, I want Gloomhaven. I want to be able to plan. I want no luck involved or minimal from that side of things. Or, you know what? Give me a good dice chucker and just chuck some dice and see what happens. And this merges the two. And, you could be feeling like it straddles the fence and doesn't give you the full enjoyment of either. You just choose one of these. If you have enough energy, there you go. But the bad guy, if you just roll the wrong thing on the bad guy, he might do damage to you. He might not do damage to you. He might resist things. He might not resist things. And you are really kind of limited to just, realistically, in this case, I start out with 3 power, 2 options. With my Raider here, I've got 1 option essentially on my turn to attack, and that's it. And I can see that being a little bit bland for people who are looking for more options there, especially with the dichotomous comparison down here to the tech tree where you're getting more options. The options are sometimes more limited up there, especially as these enemies grow in power and you go from a tier 1 blood imp to a tier 2 to a boss. That's something that is just going to be potentially not what people are looking for. Now, that's essentially also where some of these other techs and buildings come in to mitigate that and to strengthen my attacks here. Because if I have red areas, hexes on the board here with artillery forts, I can do extra damage on the conquering phase and just blow people out before they even start the battle. But if that's not your strength, if that's not the forte, now they offer more peaceful ways of sometimes negotiating and beating these beasts as well, which is going to appease some people. But if you're going for the X, most of the time you think X as in exterminate, not peacefully negotiate your land territory takeover. So minor thing there, but worth mentioning. The other side of things is I worry, again, not having played this enough, that you could start to min-max this if that is your group tendency, right? I always go for the Trap Master followed by the Invade, followed by the Subvert with the con here. Now, depending on the scenario, you're going to have different objectives as well as competitive and cooperative. And that's probably one of the biggest other boons is they've done a good job of making both feel robust enough. It's just, is that something you're looking for that incorporates both of those? Because it's going to cost you more too. The price point for this with the miniatures is going to be higher overall. And some of that is the development of having all 3 of those modes. But I will say, as a strength, none of them feel like they're half fleshed out. They feel like they're very well thought out. The solo game that I played in the intro tutorial did not feel like it was forced solo. It did not feel dramatically different than the regular game. It gave you a true feeling, which makes me feel more confident going in and saying, that those other modes are going to hold up comparatively going forward if you're looking at getting or playing through multiple of them with your same group. As I mentioned previously though as well, the other make it or break it point might be that this worker placement is not going to be necessarily as heavy, as deep, as strategic as you may fully want. You know, it's definitely not on the heavier side of things of the worker placement games I've played. I don't say that as a negative, I say that more as an FYI. If you're looking for something much more Euro-y with multiple layers, I mean, you might be better off elsewhere. But if you're looking for something that is not going to be overwhelmingly worker placement heavy, that does not feel like it bogs the mechanics down when you're looking at the other mechanics as being the stars of the show for you, it's very easily manageable. And so I can see people going either way with that as well. Weirdly enough, as I was playing it, it really gives me the closest comparison vibes to Uprising Curse of the Last Emperor with the hex-based grid system and the modularity in which you can find yourself adapting, playing, and going up against an AI system similarly. That's probably the biggest comparison I can make. I'm not saying mechanistically they're anything alike, but you can see the overlap if you're familiar with that cooperative game as well. Now, I mentioned the 4 phases, and I mentioned them in order. Now, the AI system is always going to take them in order. You are not constrained by that, which again is a good thing. You can take them in any order in which you choose on a round-by-round basis. It's going to give you some more dynamics. But the other chaos-creating thing is you're going to be having a few of these piles of cards. Of the creatures here, for example, that you're going to be having to file through, as well as the laws, as well as some of the quests. And again, for a more strategic Euro-style game, those are going to be hits and misses for you. Because as you go through these creature piles and you draw one of them, for example, you draw a law that is specifically beneficial most to you as the king, or you pull the right monster at the right time where your attribute is the strength compared to their weakness, or you draw the complete opposite one and you've already planned your strategy out for the opposite in the first place. And so that may leave people feeling a little bit wanting. The other concern I have, and I don't quite get the biggest sense of this yet, is especially in the competitive here with this grid. If you look at this grid very carefully, as you go up in victory points, you get more income. And there is a tax, a toll each round, depending on the round it is, that you have to pay. And so those are going to balance each other out. But if you're this far ahead and you're getting this much of an income disparity, I worry about a little bit of a runaway leader. There really isn't a mechanism to play catch up with. And so it's going to be a little bit unforgiving if someone really does pull further ahead, because as they pull further ahead, they stay king through these rounds, and then they continue to dictate the laws that get played each and every round that are going to provide them additional slight advantage in the first place. Now, the mitigation for that in general is that then the person who is least in victory points goes first in the next round for worker placement. But is that going to be enough, depending on the player counts, especially at the lower ones, when the spots aren't nearly as tight as they are in the higher player counts? The other thing I'll say is that the scenarios that you're provided here, in terms of the cooperative and the competitive here, this right here, for example, all of these right here, the Mad Vizier scenarios, you flip them over and they've got completely different options depending on what player you are, what rival you're going up against, and just kind of how you have to actually achieve your victory, whether it's competitive or cooperative. And so there's been a lot of work done with this as well. And so that's really impressive. And as you can see, this is just what's included with the prototype here. And this is a lot of stuff. And so that was really impressive to me to see from the get-go, to show you that this game has really been far along in terms of the design already. A lot of these are area control objectives. Control the location with this many victory points. Control enough of these types of locations with the skill check symbol of might, for example, of intellect. And then also defeating a certain enemy, and your teammates must have a certain amount of resources, depending on what the scenario is here, for example. Complete which objectives or control certain amounts of cities. All of them are going to be slightly different. and it increases the modularity, especially with all those hexes that I showed you, as well as the ones that I didn't show you in the first place. I think the other thing of note is, because some of these aren't as expansive. I mean, this tech tree is, right here, 7 pieces. That's nice. But at the same time, it's not going to give you, say, a tech tree like Eclipse or something else that is going to be drastically longer, deeper, and just more breadth. But it's not trying to be that either, because like I said, it's going to play quicker. I would make the argument that the playtimes are probably even a little bit liberal, because I found myself playing at well under the recommended or the probable timeframes that they give you in the rulebook, which was, again, a surprise for a game that I expected to be much heftier in terms of this side of things. And maybe that's just me getting used to this style of game, because that's the other thing I'll say, is that I was going into this, especially when I set this up, and I was concerned that this was going to be too much for me to take in. This was going to be so much going on, but this was by far and away much easier to learn, to play through, and to understand than I was expecting. I had an easier time understanding this, for the most part, than, say, more recently Wayfarers of the South Tigris, or something, like Frosthaven. This is much easier to understand. It's not going to give you necessarily quite the options in the same way, but the dynamic of getting it to the table easier cannot be understated in the first place with this. And just like with other asymmetric games, do you find yourself gravitating towards one faction or another? And especially over the pseudo legacy version that they allow you to add as part of it, if you so choose, you can customize your faction even further. So that's a little bit of a nice touch, but it's not forced if you don't want it to be either, because all of these scenarios, cooperative, competitive, or solo, can also just be played as one-offs. Now, there's a few spoilers in there, obviously, with a little bit of vague storyline, but it's a minor trivial point from that aspect of things. So what are my final thoughts on this right now? Honestly, it played a lot smoother than I expected it to. I like the tech trees. I like the options. The worker placement wasn't as heavy as I was fearing it was going to be in the first place. The combat was probably the thing I liked the least in terms of the mechanics. Again, not that it was bad, but that it didn't strike me as what I was expecting versus what I got in the first place, in terms of the just picking one of these and then the other opposite side rolling the AI system. And so that's true with what the worker placement is doing when you have the AI on the main board itself, but it was a little bit less satisfying overall compared to, say, the depth of the tech trees and the building and the hex-based exploration and management. Again, the exploration is, just kind of move to the spot and flip a tile over. So it's not as deep, again, in that area as you may want. The worker placements are not going to be as tight at the lower player counts. So again, things that you need to know. But the other concern I always have with crowdfunding was, how well is the cooperative, competitive, and AI-driven solo side of things going to go? Because too often in these games, one of them is really good and the other two are sort of meh. I would say that this is pulling off a rare. They're all really pretty good. They all work really pretty well. And so that was a big thing that I was concerned about going in, that I did not find myself worried about afterwards. So I give them a lot of kudos for that. There's not really a whole lot I can compare it to. It's not exactly like your typical 4X, because it's got a little bit of the randomness thrown in there with the worker placement, but it also has the hex-based modularity that some of these others are known for. But it does give me a little bit more vibe of, combination of Eclipse and Curse of the Last Emperor. And so it's just a different style of things altogether. And not that it's all completely new stuff, but it's packaged a little bit differently enough that you probably don't have anything else like in your collection in the first place. So if that's of interest to you, give it a look-see. So there you go. They sent me the prototype. I've played through it. These are my thoughts. Hopefully this is helpful. Let me know if you have any comments, questions, or concerns down below. We'll go from there. As always, thanks for tuning in. Stay classy. Have a great freaking day.
Why is it so dark? I don't know. Maybe it helps if you have both lights on, Chris.